Thank you all for joining us this morning. Delighted to see so many of you here. My name is Mary Scott, and I'm the chairman of the Board of Governors for the National Military Family Association. This morning, we will hear about key findings from the study, Children on the Home Front, the experience of children from military families. This study, commissioned by the National Military Family Association and conducted by the RAND Corporation, examines how military families are managing the stresses of war. We will also share information on the implications of the study, what we can do as caring family members, professionals, communities, and legislators to sustain these families through this time of war and when the war is over. Our mission at the National Military Family Association is to improve the lives of military families who also serve. You know that military families are strong. They are proud of their service. They are determined and committed. These past years have told a story of patriotism, but also of selflessness and sacrifice, of resilience and recovery, but also years of uncertainty and challenge. We know you understand the challenges. Your being here demonstrates your commitment to military families. Thank you. We are honored today to welcome the congressional members who are our hosts today. Senator Barbara Boxer of California, who is not yet here because of the vote being taken. Also Representative Sanford Bishop, who I don't believe is here quite yet either, but will be coming, and we hope to have remarks from them later on. Representative Kathy McMorris-Rogers, representing the 5th District of Washington State. Representatives Bishop and McMorris-Rogers are co-chairs of the Congressional Military Family Caucus. They will be sharing words with you. We also are joined by Congresswoman Susan Davis from California. She is from the San Diego district and also is the chair of the Personnel Subcommittee of the House Armed Services Committee. And also Representative Rob Whitman from the 2nd Congressional District in Virginia, which represents a lot of military folks. So we thank you so much for joining us. At this time, I think Congresswoman Kathy McMorris-Rogers will join us. We are going to launch this with Senator Boxer, but again, her duties keep her away.
Thank you all for being here this morning. A big thank you to RAND and the National Military Family Association for recognizing the need for all of us to understand how military children are being affected by multiple deployments. I also wanted to recognize Mrs. Conway and Bonnie Amos for being here. Really appreciate your commitment to the military families. Congressman Sanford Bishop, I have enjoyed working with him on the partnership for the Congressional Military Families Caucus. And our goal is for it not just to be an avenue for military families to network, but to have a voice on Capitol Hill. I think it's important for our country to recognize that when a military member signs up to serve, it's not just a job, but it's a family commitment to our country. There's probably no other group more schooled in the art of patience than our military families. They've learned to be flexible and to endure because they're a part of a system that, for all its structure, is still quite unpredictable. It's important to recognize that families from all services are in this fight today, and I'd like to recognize United States Air Force Tech Sergeant Paul Yetzuk and his family, Deborah, and their children. If you just stand up real quick. Been deployed 19 times in the 17 years of his military service. Military children oftentimes find it hard to understand why mom or dad might have to miss the baseball game or the piano recital. But today I hope that we will learn how these children are coping with the deployments and what we as a nation can do to help them and stand beside them and their families. To all the military families in our nation, your character and bravery make you role models. Know that your nation is tremendously grateful for your commitment. I'm so proud of our military families. Please accept my utmost and sincerest thank you for your honorable service.
remarks? Great.
Well, good morning. It really is an honor and a privilege to be here with you today. I want to thank the National Military Family Association and RAND Corporation for sponsoring this study. You know, it's extraordinarily important that we understand the dynamic that military families have to go through as their loved ones serve away from home. You know, as I travel around the 1st Congressional District of Virginia, where we have 7 military installations, we have every branch of the service, including the Coast Guard there represented. The one thing that I hear in common from folks there is the challenges military families face when their loved ones are away, when they're deployed, when they have different assignments, not only throughout the United States, but throughout the world. And we know the sacrifices, the true sacrifices that these families make. And for us to understand what those sacrifices entail, to make sure we can better serve those families, I think is critical. And we just went through the National Defense Authorization Act process, and one of the elements there I wanted to make sure became part of the discussion was, how do we help our military spouses, specifically as they move around? You know, military spouses also pursuing careers, and nothing's more difficult than as you move as a family and the spouse pursuing their career, whether it's professional licensure or whatever it may be. And I wanted to make sure that we were doing all we could in helping spouses as they travel around the country or even around the world in support of their loved one that's in uniform, in making sure that they found those opportunities, making sure it was easier for them to make sure that they gained employment as they help support our men and women in uniform. So it's so critical that happened, and that got into the National Defense Authorization Act. I look forward to being part of the conversation in the conference as the National Defense Authorization Act makes its way through the process. But again, I want to thank you all for the efforts that you make here in bringing all of these issues to the forefront. It is critical these days, as we look at issues in the military, both in recruitment and retention, that we keep in mind our military families. As we say, the saying goes is, you recruit soldiers, airmen, sailors, Coast Guardsmen, and Marines, but you retain families. And if we're going to have and continue to have the best military in the world, we have to keep in mind also making sure we keep up with the needs of their families. So I want to thank you all so much for all of your efforts today. It's an honor for me to be part of this as you kick off this effort. And thank you so much. And thank you so much for what you do to help our military families in their service and sacrifice to our nation. Thank you so much, and may God bless you.
Representative Davis, would you like to say a few words? I'd love to hear from you. Thank you. Represents the San Diego district, which of course includes many military families.
Thank you very much. I hadn't planned to say anything. I'll be very, very brief. And San Diego, as you all know, actually is becoming, I understand, the largest military constellations of bases in the world. So we have a lot of military families. And the best part is that I think there's been kind of a sea change in thinking about military families. Our First Lady, Michelle Obama, was just at Camp Pendleton. One of the things that she has said in speeches is how our families are kind of our quiet heroes. And we were encouraging them, and I don't even think they need the encouragement anymore, to not be quiet, because we need to hear from them. And with the help of so many of you and the work that Rand and others have done in trying to really assess the impact that being engaged in 2 wars has had on our military families, means that we are trying to understand better and certainly listen better. And I think that's so important. So thank you all. I have seen this presentation. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to leave in a minute. But it is both sobering and inspiring at the same time. Because yes, our young people are tremendously resilient. But we can't forget that there are many, many young people who are suffering today as a result of the fact that they haven't had mom and dad to be there for them when they needed them. And we need to know that. We need to be sure that we provide the services and the help and the support to help them be happy and lead productive lives. So I just want to thank all of you who have been involved in this and focused on this, because it's terribly important. Thank you.
I would like to acknowledge and thank Annette Conway and Ron Eames for being here, the senior spouses from the Marine Corps. They are wonderful examples and mentors to other Marine spouses, wonderful advocates for military families, and great friends to our association, so thank you for being here. And I would like to now introduce to you Joyce Razor, who is the Executive Director of the National Military Family Association.
Thank you, Mary, for the introduction, and thank you all for coming. A lot of you have military family connections. I have military family connections. This is personal because this is a story today about us and about our families and how they're doing and how all of us can help them from looking at what we've learned and helping military families. A little bit about our association is kind of background because this research is really a logical progression for us in terms of our history, and we were excited to commission it, and we're excited because it's the next step for us in our service to military families. I do want to let you know that as a couple of our other members come in, we'll be breaking away to allow them to speak, but I'm hoping we'll all have time for questions at the end as well. If we run over, please feel free to stop us and ask questions later. Our organization started in 1969 by military spouses, and they were concerned about the lack of survivor benefits for their families, their friends, their widowed friends, and that was our association's first success. We are military families working for military families, and we serve all 7 uniformed services and take pride in our outreach to all of those military families. A lot of that outreach done through our volunteer corps, who are in communities worldwide. What do we do? Some of you are familiar with our government relations team because you've seen them in your offices working on issues that we hear from military families, but we also do things as advocates to support military families. Representative Whitman talked about military spouse employment and education. We award scholarships to military spouses. We offer Operation Purple camps for military children and retreats for families working through that reintegration after that service member comes back from deployment. I actually just got back from a camp in Mississippi, so I can tell you all about Operation Purple, but not right now. As advocates for military families, we stand up for them to work with you and others to ensure that military families have access to quality health care, good schools for their kids, jobs for spouses, caring communities, and support, again, for those survivors, the widows and widowers. We also try to research what's going on with military families because there have been a lot of changes, and we believe it's very important to capture information about what's going on with families today. As we looked at the landscape and looked at what was happening with military families as the deployments of OEF and OIF continued, we looked at previous research, we looked at what we knew, and tried to identify gaps where we didn't know. There had been a few small studies from this population about deployment and military spouses, looking at mental health, household strain, marital satisfaction. We'd also seen some early studies on looking at data about children, looking at stress, rates of maltreatment, and school problems. What we felt was missing was research that was broader in scope that could really help guide the many, many programs that have been created to help military families since the war began. We wanted to look at specifically how children were doing and how children were saying they were doing. Parents have a lot of information about their kids and their well-being, but parents don't know all that's going on with kids because kids don't tell everything. So we wanted to look at how kids are doing academically, social, emotionally, not just because of the war, but military life in general. We decided as we planned our research to focus on preteens and teens, the kids who could verbalize the best about their experience, the kids who had also lived through multiple deployments. And we're still going through those multiple deployments. It was very important for us that any research our association commissioned was that it include both the child and the caregiver perspective. And when we saw that this research wasn't happening by others fast enough, we went to private donors, raised money to commission RAND to do the research. We felt very strongly that RAND had the tools to conduct this research the way we believed it needed to identify two key questions. How are military school-age children faring in general, and specifically, what types of issues do they face related to deployment? And I'm going to stop there because now I'm going to let you hear about the research. This is an ongoing project, but we're getting a lot of interesting information and new information and a lot of detail to tell us about how military kids are doing. And so I'd like to introduce Dr. Anita Chandra. Dr. Chandra was our primary researcher at the RAND Corporation, and it's been a pleasure to work with her, and it's also been, we've all learned a lot about military children that we're already putting into good use. So Dr. Chandra.
Thank you, Joyce, and thank you for everyone to be here today. It's really always a privilege to share the research and to make sure that some of this information is getting out to the audiences that can really act on our findings. As Joyce referenced, we were really excited to be in this partnership with NMFA to really think about the impact of deployment on children. And as many of you know, RAND has been really developing a strong portfolio of research on the effects of deployment, particularly combat deployments, on service members as well as family members. And most recently, we have produced reports and analyses looking at the effects of deployment on re-enlistment, as well as civilian earnings, divorce rates, marital satisfaction, as Joyce referenced, and most recently also produced a report on the experiences of Guard and Reserve spouses. In addition, a lot of our work has extended to the area of health and mental health. As many of you may know,
I'm going to step away.
We're so pleased that Representative Sanford Bishop could be here with us today. He is the other chair of the Military Family Caucus with Representative McMorris Rogers. Representative Bishop, we'd love to have you say a few words, and thank you so much for coming.
Thank you very much, and I apologize for interrupting the flow of things, but I certainly want to welcome the Military Family Caucus Joint Congressional Briefing, and the well-being of our military families has long been important to me. And of course, the health of our military families and safety is of great importance to the members of Congress, and particularly the families. I'm honored to include many military members and spouses in my congressional district. Back home, I represent Fort Benning. I represent the Albany Marine Logistics Base, the Worldwide Logistics Center for the Marine Corps. And of course, my district is adjacent to several other bases. We've got the Moody Air Force Base and Robbins Air Force Base that are right very, very close. So we have a great deal of family involvement with the military, and I feel it firsthand. And it's certainly a great honor for me to serve as co-chair of the Military Family Caucus of the House of Representatives. I want to thank Senator Boxer for her commitment to our military families, and we're grateful for the constant support that she has given to our families, and I look forward to continuing working with her along with Representative McMorris Rogers. She is the co-chair, and it's a privilege to join with her in working with the Family Caucus. It is so vitally important for us to be sensitive to and to understand the unique concerns, sacrifices, and problems that arise as a result of a service member's service to our country and the implications and the ramifications for family members. I certainly have to give a special thanks to the family members. Their service really goes hand in hand with the service of their military service member. And of course, the families are one of our greatest assets. As I think President Hoover said, our children are our most valuable natural resource, and so we have to do all that we can to ensure a healthy, normal lives for the children of our military families. We examine today, and you're examining today, the findings by the RAND Corporation on the impact of our families from deployments. We take a major step in examining some of the major challenges that face our families, and I certainly will pledge to you that the Military Family Caucus and my colleagues will do all that we can to utilize the information to ensure that our families get the proper care and treatment. My wife grew up in a military family, and she shared with me the various challenges that she faced as being the child of a service member. Back then they were called military brats. So today it's very personal for me. She and I had a very, very different upbringing. I can look back and I can count upon my current friends, those who I went to nursery school with. She does not have that privilege because she and her siblings moved around the country and around the world every 18 to 24 months. So it's very, very, very difficult for her to remember the names of more than 5 or 6 friends throughout her upbringing. Fortunately, she has now learned that there's an internet connection for the children who were military children, and of course she has now begun to make some of those connections. But I am especially happy to be here to encourage you and to encourage you to continue your involvement as we do all that we can to make sure that our military families are properly taken care of. What you do, your involvement will truly and will always make a difference. I always like to close my remarks with my favorite poem. Because of your involvement, I know that you can relate to this. It's called A Bag of Tools. It goes like this. Isn't it strange how princes and kings and clowns that caper in sawdust rings, and common folks like you and me are builders for eternity. Each is given a bag of tools, a shapeless mass and a set of rules, and each must make your life as long a stumbling block or a stepping stone. I'm just happy today that you are supporting our military families and that you are not stumbling blocks, but indeed are stepping stones to a higher, better quality of life for our military men and our military families. And we're here to help in any way that we can possibly help to make sure that you have exactly what you need and that you are properly respected and cared for with all the resources that we have in Congress that we can afford. Thank you and God bless you.
I'd like to introduce Senator Barbara Boxer, who is Senator from California. We're pleased that she could be here and show her support for this effort and for military families. So, Senator Boxer.
Thanks so much. I would like to ask our military families, whether current, former, retired, if you could just stand, because I'd like to be able to applaud you and have everybody else applaud you. Oh, thank you. I want to start by thanking the National Military Family Association and the RAND Corporation for undertaking this very important research on the effects of deployments on military families. On Sunday, I went to Camp Pendleton. I had the honor of spending time with Marines and their spouses and their children, and I learned something new. I was there before, and I heard the same thing this time. Our military families are strong, they're determined, but there's no question that multiple deployments take their toll, especially on the children. We all know, and we all should know, that when a service member puts on a uniform, whether they're a male or female, the entire family sacrifices for our nation. From enduring the lonely separations and the constant anxiety that comes with having a loved one in harm's way, to assuming the extra responsibility at home of running a household without a husband or a wife there to help. As a mom and a grandma, I know how hard it is when everything is in its place, let alone when someone is ill or someone is away. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan are posing unique challenges for our families, especially those with two military parents, and I want to point out family here, Jim and Laura Richardson and their daughter Lauren. I'd like to ask them just to stand for just a second. I'm not going to embarrass you in any way, but I want to just point out something about the Richardson family. Thank you. Jim and Laura are both very successful military officers. They've led units in Iraq and Afghanistan. Jim is a battlefield hero, and I've heard the stories about his valor. Laura has served as an aide to the Vice President, but they will say that their very best accomplishment is raising, in Laura's words, quote, I just get choked up, as a mother of a daughter, a beautiful young lady who is very smart and who continues to achieve her goals. And from looking at Lauren and looking at her parents and the smiles on the parents' faces and the embarrassing look on the daughter's face, I know that you have a lot to be proud of. Lauren is that magic age, 21, but when she was 14, both of her parents deployed to Iraq at the same time. Just a child, she was suddenly confronted with adult issues that most children don't have to consider. And her parents found themselves asking the same question all military parents ask. How do we take care of our kids when we deploy? And how do we keep our family happy and healthy? And this is what the study being released today addresses. The answer is not easy, and it doesn't get any easier with the second, third, fourth, or in the instant of one Camp Pendleton spouse I met, the 11th deployment. That is why I'm so passionate about championing issues that help military families. And that's why I'm so glad that so many of you come to me and ask for my help. Because I wouldn't really know of those issues unless you come and tell it to me. This isn't about politics. This isn't about party. It's about love of country and love for the people who serve this nation and put themselves in harm's way. So whether it's urging the Department of Defense to give service members flexible spending accounts so they can better afford child care and out-of-pocket medical expenses, improving mental health care, or ensuring all military children have access to high-quality education, we really can't do enough to lessen the burden on people like the Richardsons, or on that Marine wife who has endured, and of course her spouse, 11 deployments. But studies like the one released today are absolutely critical in working to ease that burden, because they give us the tools to take action to address their needs. And there are many tools, and there are many things that we can do. So I guess my real main issue in coming today, the purpose of my coming, is to let you know that you can count on me for this. And I will look at these studies, I will work with you, and frankly, when we know what we have to do to ease your burden, it's an issue that we get broad support for, from both parties, from men and women in the Congress, and of course from the President, for sure, and the Vice President. So thank you for all that you do, and continue to call on me. Bye. Thanks.
We'll continue where we left off. So as I was referencing before the Senator spoke, we have been doing a lot of work looking at the impact of the current deployments on health effects and mental health specifically. And our initial work really focused on service members. And so in 2008, for many of you who may know, we released the study Invisible Wounds of War, which really examined the mental health impacts, the post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, traumatic brain injury, and so forth on returning service member and veterans. And so that work on health effects and mental health effects on service members continues today. And there'll be some forthcoming reports on issues around suicide prevention, as well as issues around promoting resilience in military families, and particularly among service members. As many of you know in this room, the deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan are unique, and so a lot of the prior research that we had on the experience of military families may not really translate to the experience of these current wars. Certainly the deployments are characterized by greater frequency with less time in between deployments, at least initially in the first few years of the war, as well as a heavy engagement of the Guard and Reserve, making it all the more important to look at the needs of preteens and teenagers. And there's really no front line, so with the introduction of improvised explosive devices and the various insurgencies, people who are in combat support positions are still exposed to these kinds of traumatic exposures. As Joyce referenced, when we looked at the literature and what had been done to date prior to our study, there were some significant critical gaps, and our study really attempted to address two key research questions. One was, how are these school-age military children faring? We really didn't have a lot of information about military children in general and how they're doing academically, socially, and emotionally. And second, we didn't really know what types of issues they were facing, if any, related to deployment and reintegration. And so this study sought to answer those two questions. As Joyce referenced, they have sponsored Operation Purple Camps for the last several years. And because there's no national roster of all military children, we actually drew our study population from the applicants to this program. At the time of our study, there were about 9,000 kids who attended camps in the summer of 2008, which was our first survey. And as Joyce referenced, the goal of this camp really is to connect military youth and also to give them some of the skills that they may need to cope with parental deployment. We drew a sample of about 1,500 families who were applicants to Operation Purple. And in order to try and minimize some of the issues of bias and selection that we might have had pulling from this particular Operation Purple applicant pool, we designed the sample to represent the deploying personnel at the time by service and component, and we randomly selected families to represent across those service and component areas. While we take great pains in the rest of the presentation not to overgeneralize our findings, particularly because of the sample that we pulled from, this sample may be either more in need of services or less in need. We do say that this is really the largest study to date on military children, and there are a lot of key findings that are reflected here. To be eligible for our study, because we really wanted to focus on preteens and teenagers, children had to be between the ages of 11 to 17 years at the time of the first survey. Our sample was pretty evenly split by gender, so about half the sample was girls, and about a third of the sample was from a racial or ethnic minority background, which was pretty close to the service distribution at the time. The study actually includes multiple ways of data collection. This is a longitudinal study, and we collected data at 3 time points: in the summer of 2008, in the winter of 2009, and again at the summer of 2009. Each wave included a phone survey separately with the child and a non-deployed parent, and these phone surveys lasted about 30 to 45 minutes. We also have another piece of the study which included in-depth interviews with a subsample of caregivers so that we could understand a little bit more about the stressors that caregivers specifically are facing. Today I'll primarily focus on the first wave of data collection. However, I'll talk a little bit about the longitudinal data and where findings are persisting. So recall that our first research question was really to understand how military children are faring compared to other U.S. children. And we looked at 5 domains of functioning across academic, social, and emotional. There were some areas in which children in our sample were really functioning better than what we might expect in other studies of U.S. children. However, there were some areas in which they were functioning worse or more negatively than children in a national sample. First, to the areas where they were functioning better. So one area where children were functioning better or comparably was in the domain of academic engagement. And these are questions like getting homework completed on time, making sure that they attend to tasks in class, not getting into trouble in the classroom, and so forth. The other area where children were performing comparably was an area of peer relationships. And these are questions about making and maintaining friendships, as well as getting along with peers generally at school and in the community. But there were three areas of concern in which children were reporting more difficulties than other U.S. children. One was in family relationships, and these are questions about kind of getting along with people in your family at home, completing chores on time, making sure you meet household responsibilities, and so on. The other two areas in which children were expressing more difficulties was in the area of anxiety symptoms and overall emotional difficulties. And I'll talk about each of these in the next two slides. First, to anxiety symptoms. We asked children a series of questions related to their experience of anxiety. And these are questions like, I get scared for no reason, I have difficulty sleeping, and these are a 5-item scale. And what we did with that 5-item scale is we created an overall score of anxiety symptoms, and then looked at the proportion of children in our sample that were experiencing anxiety symptoms that might be considered in the elevated range. The bar on the left denotes our study sample, ages 11 to 17, and the bar on the right reflects what we might see and have observed in other studies of children on average. As you'll note in this graph, about a third of children in our sample were reporting elevated anxiety symptoms. This is about double what we would expect in other studies of children. Anxiety symptoms in the elevated range are really severe enough to warrant a follow-up clinical assessment for anxiety disorder. We should note that there are evidence-based practices and treatments for anxiety disorder if a child screened positively for it. So we do have the tools available to us, and this finding is important to look at. In addition, we looked at kind of overall emotional difficulties, and these were a set of 20 questions related to children's experience of sadness, depression, kind of related symptoms, as well as getting into trouble at school, getting along with peers, just general emotional difficulties along the continuum. And similar to the anxiety symptoms, we actually created a score based on the total emotional difficulties. And we looked at the proportion of our sample that would be considered in the moderate to high range. The bar on the left denotes our study sample, but it only looks at children 11 to 14 because that's where we had nationally representative comparison numbers from a large population-based survey upon which to compare our data. The bar on the left shows that about a third of our sample, again, is reporting difficulties in the moderate to high range, compared to only about a fifth of the national sample. We also looked at whether there were notable differences by age and gender with respect to overall child well-being, and we found that the differences were similar to what we'd expect in other civilian studies. So we found that older teens, and in our study that's 15 to 17-year-olds compared to younger teens, 11 to 14, older teens were reporting more difficulties with academic engagement issues and more risk behaviors, but they also reported fewer anxiety symptoms than younger teens. Girls, as we would expect, also reported more anxiety symptoms compared to boys. We also were really interested in understanding specifically the kind of challenges, if any, that children were facing with respect to the deployment period and the reintegration period. And for this, we actually developed a set of new scales because there weren't questions out there at the time of our study in consultation with military family experts. And so this first graph represents what youth reported as the most challenging aspects of deployment. And it's ordered in descending order by frequency. So overall, children reported that dealing with life generally without the deployed parent, getting along emotionally, was the most difficult. But they also reported challenges from helping that caregiver at home deal with life without the deployed parent. Another critical challenge was not having people understand what deployment life is like for them and what that means for their family. In addition, we looked at what parents reported as deployment-specific challenges for them, and this is the home parent or the non-deployed parent. They noted challenges of taking on more responsibilities at home, particularly caring for children during that deployment when they're wearing two hats in many cases, and also helping their child deal emotionally without the deployed parent in their life, or at least geographically in their life. In addition, they also noted the issue of a lack of community support and understanding of what deployment is like as particularly challenging. We also asked our parents and our children about, about what was challenging during reintegration when the deployed parent returned. And as you'll note by the blue bar, those are the items that youth identified as difficult, and you can see the sort of relative experience. And in purple is the parent experience for him or herself. By and large, fitting the deployed parent back into the home routine was difficult, and it was particularly difficult for the parent who might have taken on two roles when mom or the other parent was away. As also the anxiety and worry about the next deployment was challenging. The non-deployed parent also noted some challenges of dealing with the deployed parent mood changes if they came back with some emotional or other kinds of anxieties. In addition to looking broadly at what kinds of challenges parents and children were experiencing during deployment and reintegration, we wanted to understand if there were particular differences by subgroup of children in terms of who was experiencing more or less deployment-related challenges. And we identified 4 risk factors: age, gender, months of deployment, and the emotional well-being of that non-deployed parent. And I'll talk about each of these in the next few slides. First, to age. So overall, we found that older teens, and once again, that's the 15 to 17-year-olds, reported more problems during deployment as well as during reintegration. They expressed difficulties of taking on more household responsibilities, as well as missing school activities because there might not be transportation or other means to make sure that they got to participate in those activities. Older teens also reflected more difficulties during reintegration, getting to know the deployed or returning parent again, dealing with that parent's mood changes if they had any, and also trying to fit that parent back into the home routine. We also noted some key gender differences, particularly during the reintegration period. So overall, girls and boys both said that it was difficult getting to know the deployed parent again. But girls more than boys reflected greater worry or anxiety about the parent's next deployment. They also reflected more challenges dealing with that parent's mood changes and greater worry about how their parents at home were getting along. Another key finding we found was related to deployment history. What we found is that as the months of parental deployment increased, so did the challenges. In other words, the cumulative months of deployment seemed to have a greater negative effect on children, but the discrete number of deployments did not. And so simply put, a child who experienced 36 months of deployment, regardless of how many deployments that was, reported more deployment-related challenges and reintegration challenges than a child who may have experienced a total of 24 months. We also looked at some differences by other military and deployment characteristics and didn't observe any differences that were statistically significant by what service the family was in, what component they were in, or whether they were experiencing a deployment at the time of our survey. Another key finding was that the emotional well-being of the non-deployed parent really mattered. So for children whose non-deployed parent reported better emotional well-being, those children reported fewer challenges during and after deployment, as well as fewer overall emotional difficulties and other kinds of difficulties related to social and academic well-being. So in sum, we found that these were the 4 risk factors, and these potentially are the 4 groups maybe benefiting from targeted support. Older teens, girls, particularly during reintegration, children who were experiencing more months of deployment, and children whose non-deployed parent was reporting somewhat poor emotional well-being. There are several key implications of these findings, particularly for those in the Department of Defense as well as the civilian sector, who really have been implementing many kinds of military family support programs. First, our findings suggest that families who are facing more months of deployment, longer periods of deployment, may need targeted support. In particular, this older teens group and girls may benefit from support, particularly during reintegration. We also have to consider what kinds of supports we have across the entire deployment cycle, including during reintegration, and particularly for families who are now on deployment number 3 or 4, and not simply programs during the initial stages of deployment. And finally, given this key finding about the emotional well-being of the non-deployed parent, it's important for us to consider what services and supports we have for that parent, not only for his or her benefit, but also for the benefits that it will confer to the child. In sum, there's been a lot of research, not only from RAND, but from other organizations, other universities, and so on, that's really begun to demonstrate that deployment is being associated with negative effects, not simply on service member well-being, but now we're starting to really see the data on spouse well-being and children's emotional well-being. You know, it's important to note that the relationship as these wars continue between these multiple deployments and our outcomes are complex. And so we know that some of these effects may diminish over time, but some may actually worsen, and so we need to stay vigilant. And one of the things I think Joyce referenced, and one of the motivations for this study, was that prior to this work, a lot of programs were being rolled out with not a lot of data to inform them. And now we really need to invest on looking at which programs are most effective or efficacious to try and think about where we can streamline services and where we can target services for maximum benefit. I do want to say just a couple things before I pass it back to Joyce. One is that, as we referenced, this is a longitudinal analysis, and so we're finalizing some of the results from the longitudinal work. I will say that a lot of the findings that I presented today really persist, and these risk factors that I shared on the prior slides really are holding up and are robust. The other thing I wanted to mention, really based on the heels and the leadership of the work with NMFA, as well as some of the other work that we're doing, is that we're embarking on a very large study in the next month or so called Deployment Life. And this is a large study that's being co-sponsored by the Army Surgeon General, as well as the Office of the Secretary of Defense. And this is going to be cross-service, cross-component, include more than 8,000 families, and follow families over 3 years, really around the deployment period. So we can start to tease apart what is the deployment impact and what is sort of the other impacts that these families are experiencing. And that will include the service member as well as the spouse and the child, so we can start to really stitch together a whole family perspective on this experience. Thank you.
Thank you. Every time I hear the results, and as every time we get more results from RAND, I learn more, I think more about what we all need to do, and think about how can we do what needs to be done to support military families going forward. It would have been wonderful if this research was done the first year of the war, so that we had a baseline and we could continue researching, but we knew what we started with. We don't have that, but we have to move forward. And we appreciate that we were pleased that we were a part of this effort to give more information for all of us who support military families and who care about military families to use. Because this gives us information about families. There are other research projects going on that will give us more information. So how do we use these findings to target support, to enhance the strength of military families? And that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about enhancing the strength of a very determined, committed group of people who want to serve their country, who value their service to their country, and want that service to be valued, and want their family to come out at the end of this whole and strong. So as we look at this finding, and these findings, and we look at the total months of deployed, and how that really matters, how do we maintain health in families that are doing okay now? Because remember, those results said most of our families are doing okay. How do we keep them okay going forward as they continue to experience more deployments? In future research, how do we look at, does having a longer gap, a longer dwell time at home between deployments have an effect? Does that help? What else do we need to learn? What do we need to know from those families who are doing well that can help guide us as we support other families? There's been a whole lot of effort put by the Department of Defense and folks on the Hill who've provided funding and motivation for programs for families, especially with young children. Our largest population in our military family community is families with young children. We have a lot of little kids. Fewer teenage kids that were featured in our research. But we've seen some issues for those older kids. How do we find the resources, target programs to meet the needs of families with school-age children while not diminishing support for families with younger children? You know, one example, there's been a lot of resources and a lot of emphasis placed on respite care for families with children under 12. Well, what's the respite for a military mom who has a house full of teenagers? We've got So how do we help target some support for those families with older kids without diminishing all the good work and all the solid support we're giving for the families with younger children? How do we engage those who interact with the older kids? A lot of our military families with older kids aren't on a military installation. They're out in the community. The kids are out in the community. They're in civilian public schools. They're in civilian church youth groups. They're in civilian organizations like Scouts. They're playing sports on youth leagues and school teams in the civilian community. How do we engage all of those caring adults who are with those kids all the time to help bring them into the support mix and better reach out and support older teens? How do we, looking at those reintegration figures, and those reintegration findings were very important for us, and it was important for us to capture not just deployment, but also reintegration. And when you look at some of those concerns that come out about especially older teens and reintegration, the question comes up, how do we foster those relationships with that parent and that older teen while the service member is deployed so that reintegration goes a lot smoother? This is it's a question that parents ask, but it's also a question for those of us who support these families need to ask. The other finding is we see some of the results on caregivers. It's usually that military mom. Most of the caregivers in that parent at home in our survey were military moms who are dealing with the stresses of job, of being two parents, of dealing with older kids, trying to keep it all together. But how do we help them foster this work-life balance, achieve a work-life balance? How do we provide some support for them to have this and how do we help them understand that one of the best ways of taking care of their kids is taking care of themselves? So we have the research, can't sit on a shelf. What we're here today as the National Military Family Association is to tell you that we've already started looking at this research and integrating it into what we do. And we need everyone's help to continue to do this. We are looking at this information to guide our own programs, our family reintegration retreats, and our Operation Purple camps. We, for the first time, accepted a camp that has an all-girls program. Before, all of our camps had been both boys and girls. But given the findings, this camp presented a very interesting proposal on how to support military girls. So we're watching that camp to see how they do. Looking at the curriculum in our family retreats to say, are there things that we can do in that setting to help the older teen bond better with that returned parent? We met in May with a group of experts in the field of supporting women and children, not just military moms and dads and kids, but civilian organizations as well. And to say, how can we better support military children using this research to kind of guide some of our activities? We had collected a lot of ideas. We were privileged also, the First Lady came to speak, and her message really mirrored what was happening in all of the discussions as part of the summit. One of my biggest fears was that all these folks would get in a room and say, well, DOD has to do this, and Congress has to do this, and then DOD needs to do this. and have it all focused on the federal government and what the federal government can do. Well, the federal government can do a lot. But what came out in the summit from these experts, many of whom have been in the creative military family program business, was that we need, and military families need, a mix of government action and civic engagement. And that message was reinforced by the First Lady as well. There are things that the government has to do, but there are also things that every American can do, and that's where we need the help. We need the help in getting the message on the federal government side about what military families need. Some of those answers to some of those questions about what military families are going through when they're talking about that they're dealing with all of the struggles of child rearing and engagement all by themselves, or the kids are saying, people don't understand what it's like for me to deal with a deployed parent and have that deployment. So how can we help send the message to our friends and neighbors? How can they help? We do need, from the federal government, we need consistent funding for family programs. We need to encourage further research, to start evaluating all those programs that are out there, which ones are working the way they should be, which ones are meeting the needs of military families, and what is the research telling us about emerging needs that must be met by the federal government. We also ask folks on the Hill to use your bully pulpit. Go out to, when you go out to your districts, when you go out to your states, when you talk to organizations, when you're working with your district offices, talk about how support for military families begins in the community. It begins with the schools and the religious organizations and the youth groups and all of the civic organizations, and that support has to flow over the course of the deployment and not stop when that deployment's over. That it's needed as that service member comes back home, is reintegrated with the family, with the job, in the community. And so highlight those community efforts that are working well. Help get resources, help be more aware of resources in your community for local military families. We certainly have a lot. We can be a help to you in that effort. We'd like to know what's going on in your community so that we can help highlight that as well. Help connect military families with folks who are out there who want to help, and help all those folks who want to help connect with the military families who need that support. We're going to take a lot of those recommendations, work our action items, work the summit action items, where we're in the process of developing those into a blueprint for action. That will be focused not just on policymakers and government leaders, but also on researchers for other research, for organizations, for national organizations and community organizations, for the folks next door, for the folks in the workplace. How can you help military families? We need to build that structure, maintain that structure over the long term. And that's going to take all of us to engage all who support military families, not just today, not just while we still have heavy deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan, but as these families come back together and face the continued challenges of military life. There's a lot of military families get a lot of satisfaction out of their service and the interesting things they encounter in the course of a military career, but they look to you, they look to us, they look to their communities to recognize that service and value that support and show that support that they're valued. So thank you for allowing us to come talk to you about this research. We have time for a few questions from our congressional office, folks who are here from the congressional offices who like to have questions. Just raise your hands. Questions about the research, or yes, back there.
Yes, my name is Jeff Bromwitz. I'm a fellow, Army fellow in Senator Cornyn's office, and I wanted to know on the hypothesis of the findings, were they tested by? Did you find that families with more PCS moves or greater family size, were those intervening effects, or did they have any effect on the findings at all?
We did
look at household size, and that really wasn't a significant factor at all. We did look at whether they had moved, certainly between survey waves, and that wasn't shaking out as significant. There were other kinds of changes that were occurring that was reflected in some of these emotional difficulties, outcomes, and things like that. One of the key findings that we did note that's not directly related to your question, but is related to where they were living, whether they were living on post or not, or in the community. And what we did find, at least at baseline, was that those families who were living on base reported fewer deployment-related challenges and less difficulties, particularly around the community support and understanding. So,
anybody else? I thank you for coming. I know we probably keep the only thing between you and lunch maybe, and I appreciate that you coming, that you're here. Remember us, if you think of questions later, please contact us. We would be glad to answer questions, share the information. We're excited about this because it has a lot of information for all of us to use, and we want to work with you to use it the most productive way possible. Thank you.